In these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.
Good evening. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and all of us at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you to this session of Jaipur Literature Festival Online Series 2021. Presenting Looking North, Nepal and China, Vijay Gokhale and Amish Raj Mulmi in conversation with TCA Raghavan. Vijay Gokhale's diplomatic assignments include Hong Kong, Hanoi, Beijing and New York. He has served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia, Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, and Ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Gokhale was Foreign Secretary from January 2018 to January 2020. His current positions include Distinguished Professor, Symbiosis International, Pune, Non-Resident Senior Fellow, Carnegie, India, and Emeritus Resource Faculty, Rashtriya Raksha University, Gujarat. In his recent book, Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, Vijay Gokhale revisits his time in Beijing as a young official at the time of the Tiananmen Square Massacre. The events in the summer of 1989, which saw Chinese troops fire mercilessly at demonstrators, set the course of China's politics over the next few decades. He speaks of this defining moment in China's relationship with its neighbours and the world. Amish Raj Mulmi's writings have been published in the Himalayan Arc, Journeys East of Southeast, and Best Asian Speculative Fiction. He has written for Al Jazeera, Roads and Kingdoms, Himal South Asia, India Today, the Kathmandu Post, and the Record, among others. He is consulting editor at Writers' Side Literary Agency and has previously worked for Juggernaut Books and Hachette India. He's from Pokhara, Nepal. All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China, is his first book. It is steeped in long-range historical perspective and scrupulous reportage. The narrative examines Nepal's changing relationship with its two imposing neighbors and its shift towards China as a new primary bilateral partner. TCA Raghavan has retired from the Indian Foreign Service and is a former High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore. He's the author of Attendant Lords by Ram Khan and Abdul Rahim, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India, The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with Pakistan, and History Men, Jadunath Sarkar, G.S. Sardesai, Raghuveer Singh, and Their Quest for India's Past. He's currently Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, a foreign policy think tank recognized by an Act of Parliament as an institution of national importance. In conversation with TCA Raghavan, Vijay Gokhale and Amish Mulmi searched through paradigm shifts and current geopolitics to understand the present and the future, while examining the multi-layered nuances of the checkered relationship between India and China. Please do follow our handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. And all our sessions that have been broadcast till now are archived and are available to view at this site in the Mughal Tent venue. And also, of course, on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Please do feel free to ask questions by typing it in the comments link. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Looking North, Nepal and China, Vijay Gokhale and Amish Raj Mulmi in conversation with TCA Raghavan. Over to you, Mr. Raghavan.
Thank you very much, Sharupa, and thank you very much, JLF, for inviting me and Vijay Gokhale and Amish Mulmi to this discussion. Thank you, JLF, also for connecting us with books and authors, notwithstanding the pandemic we are in the midst of. Well, we are here to talk about China, and this is the first anniversary of the very regrettable clashes in Ladakh last year. But we are not talking so much today about China and India, although that will figure in our discussions, but rather about China itself and China's relations with our northern neighbor, Nepal. So Amish Mulmi has written a book about Nepal's drift to China, and Vijay Gokhale has written a book about the events of 1989 in Tiananmen Square, which he was in many ways a close eyewitness of. If I could begin with you, Amish, to talk to you about your book. You say in your book, and you in fact demonstrate very, very vividly and with a great deal of animation, the very close relationship which Nepal has had with China through history. And your book really does bring out how much of an independent relationship this is, with numerous religious, cultural, political, and economic factors underwriting it. But there is, of course, in India a view to see Nepal's third country relationships in terms of a prism which sees influence of others growing at India's expense, or a zero-sum game. How do you in Nepal view your position as being at the center of a zero-sum game between India and China? And this is really the argument that you develop in your book.
Thank you, Mr. Raghavan. Thank you, GLF, for having me over. This is quite an excellent timing in the middle of the pandemic. I think it's an interesting question, but first, I think we need to think about where such a framing comes from. And in my view, the idea that Nepal, for example, India's dominance in the South Asian subcontinent, I think a lot of it also comes from the colonial, let's say, idea of a buffer state, of how Nepal used to be viewed as a buffer state earlier. And then thereafter, after independence, as how Prime Minister Nehru sort of framed it as a security umbrella over Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan. But it's also the 21st century, and the Cold War has ended, and therefore such security doctrines have obviously tend to be seen as a thing of the past. And of course, India has itself developed a new relationship with China in terms of trade, in terms of economics. And I think if India is doing so, I'm pretty certain that there is a certain, let's say, thinking, there is a certain growth evolution in Indian thinking as well about how it sees relations within the subcontinent. For example, I mean, there is space for countries to have relations with other countries beyond India within the subcontinent, as long as India's interests have been, let's say, assured. And I think that has been a tendency in Indian diplomacy as well, and that has been seen. And I think that is the core of the thing, that it is a popular narrative. We've seen that in the recent disputes about how this constant highlighting about Nepal shifting away from India towards China. And I think it works as a popular narrative, but in reality, there is always a sort of a space between, let's say, especially for a country like Nepal, situated between two countries, there has to be a space to negotiate between two neighbors, And I think that is how let's say, the thinking over here has developed, especially post 2015, that there is perhaps a chance, or rather an opportunity that lies to the northern neighbor, with the northern neighbor. And come on, like China's infrastructure growth, economic growth, it is, everyone across the world is in awe of it. And being neighbors, I think there is this Nepali perception that we can also benefit from it,
That's true. In your book, you talk about how China enables Nepal to dream big. And it's a question I'll come back to you later. But Vijay, you have written a book about 1989 and Tiananmen Square, and I know I will come to Nepal with you too, because I know you devoted a great deal of time as Foreign Secretary on India and Nepal, given your own experience of having served in Vietnam and in China. But about your book, this is very much and very consciously so, I thought, a view, a perspective which is distinct from the Chinese statist perspectives on what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, as also the dominant, or what were once the dominant, Western perspectives. In many ways, you present an Indian perspective of how events unfolded, which is why it is such a fascinating book to read. But my question to you is, if we view the events of 1989 from today's prism, in terms of what is happening in 2021, what is so significant still about 1989 and Tiananmen Square?
Well, Raghavan, that's the basic question I set out to answer. And the answer is very simple. The players have moved on. Those who were part of the 1989 Theananmen Incident are either dead or sidelined. But the play continues to perform in the theater. And that play is the Communist Party of China. The only difference is it is bigger today. It has more money, it has more power, it has more global influence, and it is a close neighbor to us. So I felt that it was important to write about this from the Indian perspective and to basically try to explain to the reader that what happened in 1989 was not simply a historical event, but one which has a relevance to the contemporary reality as well. That was the real objective. Now, of course, the Tiananmen incident was an incident which played out at many levels. At one level, it was a political struggle within the party. At another level, it's an educative, it's a very educative incident about how to manage rising public expectations in a situation where a single party doesn't want to lose control because those expectations could be political and economic. And at a third level, it was how China managed its international relations despite the fact that it was communist. And it believed that the United States was actually interested in regime change. So in a sense, it's a very multi-layered event. And each of these three factors continue to play out in China today. We might think that Xi Jinping is the predominant leader. But I believe that deep within the party, there are factions, there is dissidence, and how the leader manages it is interesting. Similarly, there are still high-level public expectations that the Chinese leadership has to manage. And of course, it has to manage its foreign policy while preserving the dominance of the Communist Party. So that's why I think the book is not just a book on history, but a book which is relevant for Indians to understand China today.
Thank you. We'll come back to that because I do have a number of questions about how China has changed in the last 30 years. But Amish, to return to the point I made about how China enables Nepal to think big, and it is true. I think the growth of the modernization which China has undergone and the massive economic growth, it has certainly created a new narrative, not just in Nepal, but in the whole of South Asia and perhaps in many parts of the world too. But I want to draw you out about something which I thought was a little subdued in your fascinating book, which is at one stage you mention about India policy being caught in a kind of trap between the extreme animosity with which the hill elite in Nepal view it and a different perspective with which people in the Tarai and the foothills and the plains or the Madhes, as it is popularly known, view it. There is this kind of bipolarity. Do you think this bipolarity exists with China too? Is there a pan-Nepal view about China, or is it a view which is fostered and consolidated by the hill elite, to use your term?
No, I think, see, the first is obviously that China is a very new neighbor for Nepal in many ways. I mean, it became an immediate neighbor post 1950, and as I've outlined, it was only in the 21st century that it began to actively engage actively than previous years in Nepal because of certain events such as the fall of the monarchy. Having said that, I doubt there is a pan-China perspective across Nepal. I mean, there is the dominant government narrative about how China is let's say a helpful friend, a beneficial neighbor. Obviously, the idea of aid and infrastructure development that is obviously being pushed because of China's, let's say, largest post 2015. But it's also interesting and very illuminating, especially when I was traveling in the borderlands in the north. When I was in Rasua, and Rasua is where the train is from Tibet is supposed to enter, and it's pretty much the only operating land border point right now. And I asked locals over there about the train, and one very interesting answer that I found was that how does the train concern us? The train will bring goods from China to Kathmandu, and it'll probably take something back, but what will it give us, right? And I found that to be a very interesting sort of perspective from a person in a place which is supposed to benefit from, let's say, the train. And on the other hand, when I went to Mustang, and Mustang is a border that has pretty much been fenced by the Chinese after the escape of the Karmapa. And over there, you would expect a sort of a rather, let's say, a negative connotation or view of China. But there, a local told me at the pass that once this border opens up for trade, India will not be able to impose another blockade on Nepal. And I found these views to be contrasting and yet sort of encompassing what China sort of stands for in Nepal. I mean, there are many sort of views. If you ask the students who are studying in China, obviously, there is this sort of let's say optimism. There is this sort of like hope about, okay, there are new opportunities that can come out of there. But at the same time, if you ask, let's say, people who are, for example, from a member of parliament from Humla last year, he had been alleging that China has been encroaching land at the northern borders, and China sent him a threatening letter, and if anything happened to him, then China was responsible. So these are sort of like, let's say, multiple views that come up of China as well. And as, let's say, China engages itself more deeply in Nepal, as it becomes more, let's say, visible in Nepal, more such perceptions will sort of emerge, and they will necessarily not always be kind as they are today, but they will always have, let's say, a sort of view that is certainly distinct from, let's say, the singular view that has been, let's say, promoted of China as only as a helpful neighbor, you know.
Vijay, China as a helpful neighbor, this is obviously something which the Communist Party works very hard at. You've dealt a lot with Nepal. How do you see what is going to happen in the future, specifically with regard to Nepal, but also in our region as a whole?
Raghavan, Amish has written a really wonderful book. And it is worth reading, not just by professionals, but by the ordinary Indian, because it dispels many myths that we have and we have held about China and Nepal, and it certainly set me to thinking about this. I agree with a lot of what Amish said, but I think the one other important factor is that China today exercises greater influence over its peripheral areas than it has any time in past history. And therefore, in a sense, there is some part which we don't know about, and that is how China will act when it has the technological capability to overcome geographical problems. Now, what we are seeing, in fact, not just through the Belt and Road, but through China's foreign policy in general, is a greater attempt by the Chinese not just to build relations, foreign relations with neighbors, but also to involve themselves in the domestic politics of those countries. And Nepal is no exception. The fact that China had to, for instance, send a party delegation within a week of the December 2020 vote in parliament, which effectively toppled Oli, indicates the extent to which China is now getting involved in domestic politics. Now, of course, India has had a much longer experience of being involved in Nepal's domestic politics, and that has had mixed results, because politics of any country is difficult to really understand. Are the Chinese going to be in a position to do so when they are not even democratic, when they don't understand how democracies function, when they don't understand the thinking and thought process of democratic politicians? That is something which interests me greatly, because it's one thing to be friends with the country, it's another to try and influence the country internally, because you then enter the quagmire that India has for the past 70 years. But I would certainly say that Amish's book has got me thinking about a sort of doing a kind of review about where India stands after 70 years of that policy, and whether there is going to be a strategic shift in that policy.
Well, I would agree that I think, given what is happening in our neighborhood and in the wider region, it is time to do a kind of very deep review or a red team review of India's policies with regard to all its neighbors. But Amish, if I can put this question to you too, and it's also come up from one of the viewers, how easy or difficult will it be for Nepal in the future to manage this India-Pakistan, India-China binary? Now, it is given what we see happening around us, China in the South China Sea, China with ASEAN, China with Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. It's not an easy. Managing neighboring country relationships is the most challenging part of any country's diplomacy. How much of a bandwidth do you think Nepal is developing to deal with this issue of China and neighbors, given the trajectory of their relationship currently?
I think from what we've seen so far, I think there is still a tendency among, let's say, the political leadership here to sort of view India and China as a vis-a-vis, or rather as competitors that sort of benefit their own, let's say, continuation in power and so that sort of a thing. So I think this view will continue, despite there have been several, let's say, recommendations, a lot of, let's say, calls for having a proper Nepal professors to have a non-aligned foreign policy, but to actually act it out in more detail. And we've seen this, in fact, most interestingly, the US-China conflict, the US-China, let's say, contest was seen before rest of the world and actually in Nepal, because this is where the sort of, there was a war of words over MCC versus BRI, and the US Assistant Deputy Secretary of State actually said in a press conference here that Nepal should not get into a debt trap like Sri Lanka, and then the Chinese ambassador had to counter that. So these sort of push and pull tendencies will obviously come. Now, these are challenging times, not just for Nepal, but for, let's say, South Asia and the rest of the continent as well, as China rises. And then, let's say, the US and India sort of have their own views about what China's place in the world is. So I think it will become more difficult. It will become a tougher terrain for Nepal to negotiate. However, I suppose that is also where, let's say, the test of real leadership lies, to sort of, negotiate these sort of choppy waters in a way that preserves Nepali interests while keeping in mind the neighbors, let's say, interests as well. Beyond that, I mean, it is like Mr. Vijay Gokhale said, it is difficult, or rather, it is not, we cannot say it immediately about how China, let's say, will be when China is able to, let's say, surpass the Himalayan geographical challenge in all its form, and that will be, let's say, the real test when it comes. So I think it will be tough for Nepal to negotiate the next, let's say, couple of years, but it will have to do so, because ultimately, I mean, the leadership has to ensure that the country's interests are secure.
That is so. And as I said, dealing with neighboring country relationships is something which requires constant attention, and there can never be one fixed paradigm or perspective from which to view it. But Vijay, on this point about how you referred to it earlier, about how China may be tested in the future for various reasons. In your book, you refer at one stage to a kind of compact between the Communist Party and the government and the people, in the sense that post 1989, there have not been major outbreaks of protest of the kind there was of that then. Doesn't this suggest to you that the compact is actually quite strong? And even if Chinese growth rates dip a little, which they will as most of their infrastructure gets built, the compact will endure and people will be happy that they've got stability and prosperity. So why go for experimenting with change?
Well, there's no doubt that when a government year upon year delivers a real growth of 8 to 9% in the GDP and in the per capita GDP, and you satisfy the material wants of the large part of the population, then the tendency to revolt against the government diminishes substantially. And China has been able to do that for 30 years. But at the very bottom of it is a transaction. This is transactional. And if the state is unable to continue with that kind of growth and continue to satisfy public aspirations as they emerge, it could just as easily turn against them. So my own view is that while at present there does not appear to be any serious challenge to the Chinese state, because after the COVID-19, when they initially stumbled, they have recovered fairly well. We should not be ignorant of the fact that while there is stability on the surface, the system itself is very brittle. If indeed the Communist Party is this greatly loved party and Xi Jinping is a greatly loved leader, why does he not submit this to the electoral process and allow the Chinese people to decide this? On the contrary, whereas we look unstable, Indian democracy is in fact among the most stable political systems in Asia, because we have had 14 general elections and power has passed peacefully from one leader to another without any constitutional challenge. So while on the surface, of course, China is wonderfully stable and India looks to be chaotic, a small incident is more likely to disturb the political system in China than it is in India. And ultimately, that system, therefore, is more likely to collapse in China rather than in India. And we have to look at it from that perspective as well. It's only then that we can make a proper assessment of China.
That is true. In the last 25 years in India, the entire political spectrum has either been in the government or has been supportive of the government. And that is saying quite a lot for such a diverse country. That is so. But nevertheless, as I said, the Chinese achievements of the last quarter century are something which have established a new narrative for our entire region. And the point which you make, Amish, about Nepal drifting to China is an issue which comes up with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, in fact, with all our neighbors, not to say of Pakistan, where the geopolitical logic, in fact, is the strongest factor behind this narrative. But if one looks at this narrative, and how much of it do you think is related to China's power, and how much of it is related to China's truly incredible achievements in terms of improving social indicators, access to health, education, and so on? I ask because in your book, there are many references to Nepalese students in China, as indeed there are many Indian students in China. But what are the components of this narrative, this compelling narrative which China presents to our neighborhood today?
No, see, with respect to Nepal, I think one has to distinguish first that Nepal has not seen the sort of Chinese investments, say, a Sri Lanka or a Bangladesh has seen. So a lot of this perception building is actually very, very recent. And I would say non-investment in its nature, or not derived from the investment per se in its nature. A lot of, let's say, Nepali interaction on a day-to-day basis comes from the increasing number of Chinese tourists, and tourism obviously is the mainstay of the Nepali economy. And in the last, let's say, 10 years or so, we've seen tremendous rise in the number of Chinese tourists. We've seen, let's say, businesses that are catering specifically to them, travel businesses, hotel businesses, restaurants, beyond that. And we've also seen a lot of, let's say, Chinese investment coming into, obviously beyond the private sector, beyond the cement factories that I've talked about. In hydropower, there's a lot of, and Chinese aid projects are also very, very visible. In Kathmandu, in fact, the best road, or rather the newest swankiest road in town currently is the new ring road that China has upgraded, and it's a four-lane road that it's pretty much the widest road in Nepal. China has reconstructed the oldest school in Nepal, and it stands in the middle of Kathmandu's busiest carriageway. So these sort of perception, visually, let's say, arresting images are of course there for everyone to see. So I think that also generates an image of its own. And beyond that, there are, let's say, there are small little instances, like, I mean, along the border regions, all the 15 border districts now receive aid directly from China, whether in terms of food or kind, or let's say in Mustang, they've set up a solar plant. In Raswa, in fact, they're building a dry port. So these sort of local interventions also create a perception of China as this, let's say, beneficent aid giver, And I think that is something that our current Prime Minister also pushed during his electoral, let's say, campaign in 2017, late 2017 to early 2018, where he sort of projected this idea of Sukhi Nepali, Samriddha Nepal, essentially saying that Nepal will become richer through infrastructure development. And the obvious, let's say, the underlining between the lines, you could read that, okay, China will assist in doing so. And so I think these sort of interventions obviously create that perception, right? And like I said, the more one engages with China, the more, let's say, this relationship develops and more interactions occur on a people-to-people relation. A lot of it is still driven from the government's perspective. It's a government-to-government relationship, as I've argued. So it's not really reached that people-to-people stage as, let's say, the India-Nepal relation has reached, right? So there is still some time to do for that. But for now, it is true that this Chinese perception is very, very, let's say, positive in the country.
There are a number of questions, Vijay, on this very point, that what are the lessons for India in terms of Nepal looking north and this compelling narrative which China seems to provide to all our neighbors? How will the US idea of build back a better world counter China's BRI? But the short point is that given the force of the Chinese narrative in terms of tourism, even in terms of culture, in terms of students, etc., what should we be doing about it?
Well, I think we have to begin by accepting that post-2008, India's overwhelming influence in Nepal is now being balanced by a growing Chinese influence. In other words, whereas earlier we had the luxury of essentially taking time to correct our own mistakes, we don't have that luxury anymore. Having said that, I think we also need to recognize that entering into an unlimited competition with China is suicidal. Because we don't have the financial bandwidth, nor do we necessarily need to do that. A lot of what China is doing, as Nepal will realize, I have no doubt in due course, is not for the sake of Nepal. It is for the sake of China's security. Amish, for instance, mentioned the question of China giving a lot of assistance to the 15 border districts of Nepal. However, that has an obvious security dimension. One of the principal goals is to ensure that Tibetan inflow and outflow from those districts ceases, and also that any subversion that might take place either by the Tibetans or by an outside force supporting the Tibetans can't operate. That's the principal reason why China is providing assistance and operating in the border districts. Now, of course, it has a knock-on effect for the local population, and it does create a certain positive perception. But in the longer term, my sense is that it depends on how China handles this much greater involvement in internal affairs. And to my understanding, even a democracy like India has found it difficult to deal with other democracies in our neighborhood. And I'm not just speaking of Nepal, I'm speaking of Pakistan, where you've been, of Bangladesh, and increasingly of Bhutan. China has no experience of dealing with democracies. And it assumes it can separate politics and economics, which is never the case. When you start investing large amounts of money, politicians from the other country get involved. And if you please one politician, you displease 20 others. Let's see how China deals with this. But nonetheless, for India, the lessons are clear. We have to recalibrate. We have to reset our relations with Nepal. We have the window of opportunity to do so at the moment. We need to look at it strategically and not treat Nepal as if we are dealing with the province of India.
And if I could just repeat what you said earlier, we shouldn't burn ourselves out trying to compete with China. Now, those are very valuable insights, Vijay. But Amish, let me ask you a question because you've obviously studied this a great deal. I know you're a close observer of what happens in India too. But the overwhelming inclination in India to see everything which is happening in Nepal in terms of a Chinese hand, and I know you refer to numerous instances in your book. How much of an effect does this have on opinion in Nepal? Because I know from my own experience that often what is not government policy but may form part of public opinion is seen as government policy in many of our many of our neighbors.
That's absolutely right. In fact, I have argued several times here that during last year's Kalapani dispute as well, when there was a lot of, let's say, lots of vitriol going on back and forth between both sides, that what the Indian media does sort of give a sense of what the government is thinking, but do not take the Indian media's words as, let's say, canon, or how the Indian government is looking at Nepal. And I think that's very interesting because it's like, just recently, I saw this one clip of one Hindi news channel, which essentially said that China's new weapon was releasing floodwaters from Nepal into India. And just, I mean, these are obviously outrageous ideas. And when you think about it regularly, it's like, obviously you're just doing it to gain TRP. You're just going, but these sort of Indian news channels also forget that they are broadcast in neighboring countries, and that sort of shapes the perception, because in democracies, like Mr. Gokhale said, that democracies are chaotic sort of beings, but there is an order, and that order, that the public perception is sort of created from these, let's say, what India is doing or how India is viewing Nepal. And I think these are very important ways in which public perceptions are shaped. And yes, like, the argument is there is the argument that, of course, that it is not always the Indian government that is saying something, or what is reflecting in the media that is necessarily the truth, but it goes a long way in shaping perceptions. And that is I think one of the things that I say in my book as well, that I think India needs to understand its neighborhood better. I think there is this gap in knowledge of how, let's say, Delhi understands its neighborhood beyond the security, let's say, doctrine or the security perspective. And I think there is still a large scope for that. And a great example of that, in fact, in recent times is, in fact, India's policy in Nepal post 2015, when after the blockade and everything like that, India sort of withdrew from the politics, and it began to focus a lot more on its development projects, where a lot of earthquake reconstruction was happening. The Kathmandu-Raxaul railway DPR is moving ahead. In fact, an oil pipeline has been inaugurated. A second oil pipeline from India to Nepal is being made. So these sort of things obviously create a different narrative for India in the country, right? And these are strategic gains. These are gains that you will not like Delhi will not lose despite the state of the politics. And that is my argument, that I think India should not, let's say, forget what gives it this sort of prime importance in the region. It's not, I don't think it's the security angle as much as it's this cultural and, let's say, economic links that it has with other countries in the region. And I think the more it plays that up, I think better, India will be perceived in the region and in Nepal as well.
So in short, you and I, in fact, agree with you. I don't know whether it's feasible. I'll ask Vijay that. But your view is that India should resist the temptation of getting involved in internal Nepalese politics. Vijay, that was the substance of what Amish said when I think we lost you for a minute. Do you think that is possible, given the kind of very dense relationships which exist? And these are relationships which have developed over a period of time. There's all kinds of internal domestic factors in India also involved. There are also there are ideological issues involved. Do you think it's possible for us to resist the temptation of getting involved?
Personal relationships between Indian leaders and leaders of all our neighboring countries are important. There's no doubt about that. Because culturally, ethnically, linguistically, and otherwise, we have certain connects. But I think as a country, we have to take a state-to-state approach to the relationship. If we approach relations in our neighborhood as if we are dealing between the center and the state, or if we tend to deal with them in the mindset of Indian politics, then we'll end up getting sucked into their politics. Now, I'm not denying the fact that it actually suits political personalities from our neighborhood to play politics and to suck us into their politics, and that is unlikely to stop howsoever we may behave. But there is, I think, a case to be made for us to behave with our neighbors in a state-to-state way, rather than in a person-to-person or in a or in a cultural manner, I would say.
So we should try to keep the Beti Roti Ka Rishta somewhat in the background and not upfront it so much as we often tend to do. I think that point is a very valuable one, and possibly not just for Nepal, but also for other countries in our immediate neighborhood. Vijay, we have a couple of minutes more.
Sure.
Given your experience of living in Vietnam and seeing China from a Vietnamese perspective, and then we see what is happening in Cambodia and Laos vis-a-vis Vietnam and vis-a-vis China, how different is what is there with Nepal and India from that?
The one big difference between India and Nepal and between China and Vietnam is that both of them have the Communist Party. So there are fraternal relations between them, not necessarily because they like each other, but because they are an endangered species in the world. To that extent, I therefore believe that the existence of the Nepal Communist Party, which in a way has been midwifed by the Chinese side because they brought together the Maoists and the UML, is also something which suits China. And the Nepalis have to take a good look at whether or not they will be prepared to accept that in the long term, when China moves to shore up the position of the Nepal Communist Party, the losers will be the other democratic forces in Nepal. This is something that Nepalis have to think beyond a 4 or 5 or 10-year perspective, because China is now there in for the long haul. And to them, their best bet is the Nepal Communist Party. And to keep them in power, they are quite capable of subverting and undermining other political forces in Nepal. So I think this is something which they need to keep in mind. In Vietnam, this is not a problem. It's a one-party state. So the Vietnamese don't have an issue with that. But if party-to-party relations are kept aside, I think there is a fundamental streak of anti-China in the Vietnamese, given their history and given their culture. And I think that will continue.
Well, thank you very much, Amish. Thank you, Vijay. Fascinating conversation. Our time is up. There were many other things we could have discussed, but I'm sure we'll have other opportunities. Thank you very much, JLF, again, for inviting us for this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Raghavan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vijay Gokhale. Thank you, Amish Mulmi and Mr. Raghavan, for that fascinating analysis of Indo-Nepal and China relationship. In fact, you put the relationship of that whole region, really, our whole region in perspective. Thank you all for being a great audience. On behalf of all of us, please stay safe, stay double masked, and we'll see you next week on the 25th of June, when we'll be presenting on first edition at 7 p.m. We'll be launching The Rain Maiden and The Bear Man, Easterine Kaya in conversation with Preeti Gill. And at 8:30 p.m. on the 25th of June, we'll be celebrating the World Unity Week by presenting The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. There'll be Dipesh Chakravarti and Homi K. Bhabha in conversation. See you then. Good night.
In these times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.